They didn't even bother landing a real ship over us. That's the part nobody believes when I tell it. The big silver things, the cathedral-sized warships, those went to the towers downtown, to the harbor, to the places with glass and money. Over the flats, they sent a drone. One drone, about the size of a delivery van, painted that bone-white color all their machines had, hovering low enough that you could see the dirt our weather had already put on it. They sent a van to conquer us. That's how little they thought of the place I grew up. My name's Desmond. Most people down here just call me Des. I ran a repair garage off the old Marginal Way, the kind of shop where the sign's been broken so long that nobody remembers what it used to say. We fixed cars, generators, water pumps, anything with a motor and a problem. And on the day the sky filled up, I was lying on my back under a 2031 pickup with a busted alternator, listening to the radio cut out, when my whole world changed its color. Let me back up. Let me tell it the way it happened. Because if I just give you the ending, the part with the river and the cranes, and the thing we did that I still don't fully understand, you won't feel it. And you have to feel it. These people earned that much. You have to understand the flats first. If you've never been to Seattle, forget the postcards. Forget the coffee and the mountain and the clean, rich neighborhoods up on the hills. Down where the Duwamish River runs brown and slow through the south end of the city, there's a stretch of ground the maps just call industrial. We called it the flats. Warehouses, scrapyards, half-dead factories, and the houses crammed in the cracks between them. The cheapest dirt in the whole region, because the air smelled like diesel and the ground had been poisoned so many times nobody could afford to fix it. That's where the poor people lived. The immigrants, the dock workers, the welders, the night shift people. My mother came here from Lagos with 2 suitcases and a baby, that baby being me, and she cleaned offices downtown for 30 years so I could grow up under that gray Seattle sky. The flats raised me. Cheap rent, hard hands, and a kind of stubbornness you can't teach. I want you to picture it the morning it started. Late September. That cold drizzle that isn't really rain, just the air being wet at you. The kind of morning where the whole neighborhood is the same color as the sky. There was Marisol 2 doors down, frying plantains, her kitchen window fogged up. There was old man Fam at the corner, opening his shop, dragging out the crates of cabbage and dragon fruit like he'd done every single day since 1989. There was the school bus wheezing past with its bad brakes. There was the freight train somewhere, always somewhere. You stopped hearing it after a while. And there was me, under that pickup, swearing at an alternator, with a coffee going cold on the workbench. That was the last ordinary morning. I think about it a lot, how small it was, how I didn't know to hold on to it. The first thing was the dogs. Every dog in the flats started barking at the same second, not the usual barking. This was the bad kind, the kind that means a thunderstorm 3 towns over, the kind animals do when the air does something we can't feel. I rolled out from under the truck because you don't ignore that. My knees popped. I'm not young. I stepped out into the lot, wiping my hands on a rag, and I looked up. The clouds were lit from above. That's the only way I can say it. That low gray ceiling we always had, it was glowing like there was a second, brighter sky pressing down on the first one. And then the ceiling parted. Not torn, not blown open. Parted, peeled back polite and slow, like a hand pulling back a sheet. And the ships came down through the gap. I've heard a lot of people describe that moment. The newscasters who survived, the ones who wrote books, they all reach for words like majestic and terrifying. I'll tell you what it actually felt like, standing in a scrapyard in the rain. It felt like being a kid who finds out the adults were never really in charge. It felt like the ground I'd stood on my whole life had just turned out to be a leaf floating on top of something enormous. They were beautiful. I hate that they were beautiful. Long and pale and smooth, no rivets, no seams, like they'd been grown instead of built. They didn't roar. The biggest one, the one that went and parked itself over downtown like a tombstone over the whole city, made almost no sound at all, just a pressure, a hum you felt in your teeth. Marisol came out onto her step in her apron, plantain still on the fork in her hand. Fam stood frozen by his cabbages. Up and down the street, doors opened, and the whole flats just stood there, looking up. A neighborhood of poor people, holding their coffee, holding their kids' hands, watching the end of the world arrive over the rich part of town. And then the van came for us. I keep calling it a van because that's the size of it, and I refuse to give it more dignity than that. The white drone dropped out of one of the smaller ships and slid down over the flats, slow, methodical scanning. A blue light swept the ground in lines like a copier going over a page. It went down our street, over the houses, over Fam's shop, over my garage, over us. And then it spoke. It spoke in English. Perfect English, no accent, a flat, clean voice with no person behind it. It came from everywhere at once, from the air itself, loud enough that Marisol dropped her fork. It said, "Survey complete. Sector designation, Duwamish industrial margin. Population, low value. Infrastructure, obsolete. Recommended classification, clearance eligible." Clearance eligible. I didn't know what it meant. Nobody did, not yet. But you knew it wasn't good, the way you know a doctor's voice is bad news before the words land. Then the voice did something I'll never forgive. It laughed. Or the closest a thing like that can come to laughing, a little downward chime, almost amused, like a person finding a coin under a couch cushion, and deciding it's not even worth bending down for. "Note," it said, "this sector requires no garrison. Pacification unnecessary. The inhabitants present negligible capability. Proceed with primary objectives. This margin will be cleared at convenience." And the drone just turned and left, drifted off toward the harbor like we were nothing, like we were a stain it would get to wiping up later once it finished the real work. I want you to sit with that. The most powerful thing any of us had ever seen looked at our entire world, our families, our homes, every hard year my mother spent on her knees scrubbing other people's floors, and it decided we weren't even worth sending a soldier for. It decided we'd be easy. The next 2 days, the city above us came apart. We heard it more than saw it, the booms rolling down from downtown, the strange silences after, the radio stations going off one by one until there was just one left, some kid on a ham setup reading reports in a shaking voice until he stopped too. The power grid stuttered, came back, stuttered, and then on the second night it went out for good and stayed out. The invaders, we learned later people were calling them the Altu, that was the name that stuck, though God knows where it came from. They weren't here to kill everyone. That would have been almost easier to understand. They were here to take the fresh water, the deep harbor, the shipping, the flat buildable land. They moved through the city like a man moving through a house he's just bought, deciding which walls to knock down, the rich districts they wanted, so they emptied them. The people who lived in the glass towers got loaded into pale transports and taken north, we think. Nobody who went came back to say. But the flats they ignored, clearance eligible, get to it later. We were the closet they deal with after the renovation. And here's the thing that I think the Altu never understood, the thing their scanners couldn't read off our rooftops. Being ignored gave us time. It was old man Fam who said it first. We'd gathered maybe 40 of us in the back of his shop on the third night, by candlelight, because his shop had the only generator left that the grid failure hadn't fried, on account of I'd built it for him myself out of a tractor engine, and it didn't care about anybody's grid. People were scared, people were crying. Marisol's husband Tomas was talking about running, about loading the kids in the truck and driving east into the mountains. A lot of people wanted that. It made sense. You protect your kids, you run. And Fam, who must have been 80, who'd survived one war already on the other side of the world before he ever came to this country, Fam held up his hand, and the room got quiet, because when a man that old wants to talk, you let him. "They are not watching us," he said. His English was careful, slow. You understand, they watch the harbor, they watch the towers, they put their soldiers there. Here, he tapped the table, here they put nothing, because here they think is nothing. He looked around the room at all of us, at the welders and the mechanics and the dock workers and the cooks. They think we are nothing. He let that sit. In my life, he said, I have been thought nothing before by bigger men than this. It is a mistake they make, always the same mistake. He smiled then, just a little, a thin old smile with a lot of years behind it. When the strong man does not look at you, that is not weakness for you. That is your chance. Nobody said anything for a minute. Then Tomas, who'd been talking about running, said quietly, "Chance to do what, old man? Look at them. Look what they did to downtown. We've got what? We've got wrenches." And Fam looked at him, and he looked at me, and he said the thing I've never been able to forget. "Tomas," he said, "who do you think built the city they want to steal?" I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my garage in the dark with the cold coming up through the concrete floor, and I thought about what we had. Not what we wished we had. What we actually had in our hands in the flats. We didn't have guns. A few hunting rifles, some old pistols, nothing that would scratch the paint on one of those ships. We didn't have soldiers. We didn't have a plan or training or anybody coming to save us, and I want to be clear about that because I've heard the story told wrong since then, told like the military came roaring in at the last second. They didn't. Nobody came. Whatever happened in the flats, it was the flats that did it. But we had things the rich districts never had. That was the part the Altu scanner read as obsolete. Obsolete. They had no idea. We had the scrapyards. Acres of them. Mountains of steel and copper and engine blocks and old machinery, 3 generations of the city's discarded muscle, all of it ours, all of it forgotten by everyone with money. We had the river, the Duwamish, slow and brown and ours, with its old industrial channels and its dredge-deep shipping turns, and its tide that came in twice a day whether anyone was watching or not. We had the cranes, the big container cranes down at the working terminals, the ones the Altu had flown right past because they wanted the deep-water harbor for their own ships and figured the human machines were just scrap they'd melt down later. Cranes that could lift 40 tons. Cranes my cousin Jerome had operated for 11 years and could run with his eyes closed. We had the welders, the pipefitters, the machinists who could read a busted thing and know it like a doctor knows a body. We had electricians who'd wired half the city. We had a guy, Boone, who used to do demolition and still had a contractor's idea of what holds a structure up and what brings it down. And we had something the Altu scanner had no way to measure, no column on its survey for, no value it could assign. We had each other. We had a whole neighborhood of people who'd been told their whole lives they were nothing, who'd held that line together anyway, who knew every alley and rooftop and storm drain of this poisoned ground, because it was the only ground we'd ever been allowed to have. You don't conquer that with a van. The next morning I called a meeting, a real one, not 40 people, everybody. We packed them into the old cannery, the one that had been empty for 20 years because it was the only space big enough. Hundreds of people, the whole flats near enough, standing on the cold floor where machines used to gut salmon by the ton. And I'm not a speech guy. I fix engines. But I got up on a forklift so they could see me, and I held up the only thing I had to show them, a piece of the white drone's casing, a fragment Boone's nephew had found where the thing had clipped a power line and shed a panel. Just a curved white shard, light as plastic, but you couldn't scratch it with a knife. I held it up. "They sent a van for us," I said. The cannery was dead quiet. You all heard it. Low value, negligible capability, clearance eligible. They scanned our whole lives and decided we weren't worth a soldier. I let it ring. "Now," I said, "I've been thinking about that, and I think they're right." Murmurs, confusion. I held up my hand. "I think they're right that we can't fight them, not the way they expect. We can't shoot their ships. We can't out-tech them. If we line up and charge, we die and our kids die, and that's the end of the flats. I looked out at them, at Marisol, at Fam, at Jerome the crane man, at Boone the demolition guy, at every welder and cook and machinist in that cold room. But they made one mistake. One, they told us out loud that they're not watching. I turned the white shard in my hand. They're not coming for us yet. They think we're already beaten. They think we'll just sit here and wait our turn. And that, my friends, I felt my voice catch, and I let it, because they needed to hear that it cost me something to say. That gives us the one thing nobody down here has ever had enough of. Time, said old man Fam from the front, loud enough for the whole room. Time, I said, and a scrapyard, and a river, and every stubborn pair of hands in this district. I'm not going to pretend the whole room cheered. It didn't. Real people don't. Half of them were terrified, and they were right to be. But I watched something move across that crowd face by face, something that started in the hands. The welders looked at their own hands. The crane men, the machinists. I watched people look down at the things they could do, the skills they'd been told were obsolete, and I watched them start to do the math. Boone, the demolition man, was the one who finally spoke up. Big quiet guy, never says much. He crossed his arms and looked at me and said, "What's the plan, Des?" And the truth is I didn't fully have one yet, but I had the start of one. I had the shape of one. I'd spent that sleepless night turning it over, and it came down to a single ugly question that I put to the whole room right there. What happens, I said slowly, if one of their big ships needs the deep channel of our river? And what happens if our river decides not to give it to them? Now I have to explain about the harbor, because this is where it turns, and you have to understand the ground. The Altu wanted the deep water harbor. That was always clear. A species that crosses the dark between stars still needs water and depth and shelter for the things it builds, and Seattle's harbor was one of the best on the whole coast. They'd parked transports and a few of those long, pale ships out in the Sound, and over the first week we watched them begin the work of moving in. Dredging machines, anchor structures sinking into the seabed. They were settling, building, treating the harbor like it was already theirs, because as far as they were concerned, it was. But the harbor connects to the river. The Duwamish empties into it, right through the south end, right through the flats. And the deepest, most useful part of the lower channel, the part a big ship would want to use to bring something inland, up off the open water and into the protected industrial heart where they could build without weather, runs right past the old container terminals, right past Jerome's cranes, right past the cannery, right through our front yard. We learned by watching, by listening to the few radios still working, by piecing it together night after night, that the Altu were planning to bring one of their mid-sized vessels up that channel. A construction ship, we thought. Something to anchor the whole operation. They needed it inland in the deep channel in the protected water. They needed our river. And our river, friends, our river ran past the most heavily junk-filled, crane-studded, welder-infested, demolition-experienced stretch of ground in the entire city. The Altu had a scanner that called all of that obsolete. We had Jerome, who knew exactly how deep that channel was, where it was deep and where it lied about being deep. We had Boone, who knew how things fall down. We had 100 welders. We had the cranes. We had 3 generations of the city's discarded steel sitting in mountains a quarter-mile from the water. And we had 2 weeks before the tide, and their timeline lined up. Old man Fam had been right. The strong man wasn't looking at us. So we got to work in the dark. I won't tell you it was clean. I won't tell you nobody got hurt setting it up, or that we all agreed, or that there weren't 3 solid days where I was sure we were all going to die for nothing, and it was my fault for talking them into it. But I'll tell you how it started. It started with Jerome climbing up into the cab of the biggest container crane on the south terminal at 2 in the morning, with no lights, in the rain, while 2 welders held a tarp over the cab window, so even the faint glow of his instruments wouldn't show from the harbor. It started with him running his hands over controls he hadn't touched since the day the world ended, and finding them exactly where his hands remembered, and powering the thing up on the auxiliary diesel I'd spent a night getting to turn over. It started with that crane, slow and silent and 40 tons strong, reaching out over the black water of our river in the dark, and beginning, very carefully, to lower the first piece into the deep channel. We were going to give the Altu their river. We were going to give them every single rusting, obsolete, low-value, clearance-eligible ton of it, right where their ship needed to be. We had 9 nights. That's what it came down to once Jerome figured out their timeline. 9 nights to do a thing that no part of any of us had been trained for, with no second chance, in the dark, under the noses of people who could have ended us in a breath if they'd bothered to look down. 9 nights to turn our river into a wall. Let me tell you what a scrapyard sounds like at 3 in the morning when you're trying to be quiet, and you can't be. It sounds like guilt. Every piece of steel we moved announced itself. A girder dragged across concrete screams. A chain under load sings a high note you feel in your back teeth. We muffled what we could, wrapped the chains in old fire hose, laid down rubber mats, greased everything that could squeal, but you can't make 40 tons of moving metal whisper. You just can't. So we did the only thing we could. We learned the harbor's rhythm. Marisol's youngest, a girl named Pillar, 16 years old and sharp as a tack, sat up on the cannery roof every single night with a pair of binoculars and a notebook, watching the Altu out in the Sound. And she figured out something none of the rest of us had the patience to see. Their machines pulsed. The big dredgers, the anchor sinkers, all of it ran on some kind of cycle. Every few minutes there'd be a surge of light and a deep grinding pressure that rolled across the whole water, and during those surges, you couldn't hear anything else. The whole Sound drowned in it. So that became our metronome. Pillar would watch for the light building, and she'd wave a shielded flashlight down at the terminal. One flash and Jerome would haul, and Boone's crew would drag, and every welder would strike their arc all at once, in that window, in the noise, in the cover of the enemy's own machinery. And when the surge faded, everything in the flats froze. Stone still, tools down, breath held. We built our wall in their blind spots. We built it in the gaps in their attention. We let the invaders themselves cover the Sound of their own undoing, and they never knew, because to look down and check would have meant believing there was something down here worth checking. There wasn't, as far as they knew. We were clearance eligible. God, I loved that word by the end. Clearance eligible. We wore it like a coat. Here's what we actually built. I want to tell it plain, because people have made it sound like magic, and it wasn't magic. It was math and steel and 100 stubborn people. The lower channel, the deep part the Altu ship would have to come up, had one tight turn. One pinch point where the dredged deep water narrowed between the old terminal pilings. Jerome knew it cold. 11 years bringing container ships through that exact turn, he could have drawn it in his sleep. A big vessel coming up the channel would have to slow there, line up, thread it. That's where we made our wall. Underwater, where no scanner sweeping the surface would read it. Boone's idea, and it was a good one. We didn't build above the waterline where they'd see. We built below it. Down in the brown dark of the Duwamish, in the cold, in zero visibility, the flats sank a forest of steel into the riverbed. Jerome's crane lowered the big pieces, engine blocks, girders, an entire scrapped rail bogie that must have weighed 30 tons, and Boone's divers, working in shifts in the freezing water with hardware store dive gear and welding rigs we'd waterproofed by hand, anchored them into the silt and chained them together into a tangle. Not a clean wall. A worse thing than a wall. A snarl. A deliberate, vicious, low-lying tangle of the city's heaviest junk, positioned exactly at the depth where the belly of a big ship would ride. And on top, near the surface, we ran cables. Salvaged crane cables thick as your wrist, the kind rated to hold 40 tons. We strung them across the narrow turn, slack, sunk just under the water, anchored to the pilings on both sides and to the cranes themselves. The plan, if you can call something so desperate a plan, was simple to say and terrifying to do. Let the ship come up the channel. Let it reach the turn. Let it slow the way it would have to. And then have the flats, every crane, every winch, every machine we could chain into the effort, pull the cables tight at once. Foul the channel. Snag the hull. Wedge that ship into a turn it could not complete, over a tangle of steel it could not pass, in water too shallow ahead and too snarled below to escape. Trap it, pin it, beach the thing in our river. We couldn't kill it, we knew that. We had no weapons that mattered, but a ship that can't move is a ship that needs help, and help would have to come from the harbor, through the channel, past us. We weren't trying to win the war. Nobody in the flats was crazy enough to think we could win the war. We were trying to make ourselves expensive. We were trying to make the strong man finally look down. The night it came, I almost called it off. I'll tell you that honestly. Around midnight, with pillars signaling that the ship had detached from the harbor cluster and turned toward the river mouth, I stood at the edge of the channel with Boone, and I felt the whole thing turn to ash in my mouth. The size of what we were about to do. The kids in the cannery. Marisol's face when I'd told her where Pillar would have to be. Every person I'd talked into this. If it failed, if the ship just rolled over our wall, or its scanners caught the trap, or it simply blew the whole turn to slag the second it felt resistance, then I hadn't saved the flats. I just made sure the Altu would stop ignoring us. I'd hand-delivered us out of the only safety we had, which was being beneath their notice. Boone must have seen it on me. He put one big hand on my shoulder. Demolition Man never talks, and he said, quiet. Des, we already decided. The whole street decided. You don't get to carry it alone now. That's not yours to carry. And down the line in the dark I could feel them. Not see, it was too dark. We ran no lights but feel. The welders at their stations. Jerome up in the crane. Fam, who'd refused to leave, sitting in a folding chair by the channel edge with a thermos like he was watching a sunset. Tomas, who'd wanted to run, who'd stayed, manning a winch with his sleeves rolled up. Hundreds of people I'd grown up beside, breathing in the cold, waiting. The whole flats, holding its breath in the dark, waiting for one man's word. I gave it. I keyed the radio, a kid's walkie-talkie. Half our coordination ran on toys, and I said the only thing we'd agreed on as the signal, because we figured if the Altu were listening, it would mean nothing to them. I said, fam, your cabbages are ready. And the river came alive. The ship came up the channel slow. It was beautiful and it was wrong, the way all their things were. Pale, smooth, long as a city block, riding low in the water with a hum that pushed the river out in flat black ripples ahead of it. It came up our channel like it owned it, like it had always owned it, lights moving under its skin, utterly unworried. Why would it worry? It was passing through a margin its own scanner had called obsolete. It was driving through a junkyard. It reached the turn. It slowed, exactly where Jerome said it would, exactly where it had to. The hull swung, lining up to thread the narrow water between the pilings, and for 1 second one held, frozen, eternal second. The belly of that ship sat directly over our snarl of sunken steel, and its flank sat directly across our sunken cables, and the whole long length of it was committed to a turn it could not abort. That was the second. Now, I said, now. Every crane in the South Terminal hauled at once. I have run machines my whole life. I have felt big engines strain. I had never felt anything like the sound the flats made in that moment. Jerome's crane and 3 others, every winch, every chained-in motor, every diesel we'd nursed back to life. All of them taking the load at the same instant, and the cables came up out of the water, streaming, shedding the river in sheets, and they caught. They caught the hull. The ship lurched. I felt it through my feet, through the ground, the whole channel shuddering as that beautiful pale thing met something it had not been told to expect. It tried to power forward. The cables screamed. The cranes screamed back. Steel against starship, the city's discarded muscle against the dark between stars, and for a moment I thought our cables would just snap, that we'd built a spiderweb against a freight train. And then the ship's belly found the snarl. It rode down onto our forest of sunken steel, engine blocks, girders, the great dead weight of 3 generations of the flats, and it grounded. Hard. The hum spiked into a shriek of strain, the water boiled white around it, and the ship stopped. Wedged. Snagged above, beached below, jammed into a turn it could not complete in a channel it could not pass. 1,000 miles of impossible technology, brought to a dead halt by a junkyard and a river, and a neighborhood of people who were supposed to be nothing. The flats didn't cheer. We were too scared. We just stared at the thing we'd done, this enormous trapped animal thrashing in our river, and we knew, every one of us knew in the same instant, that the strong man had just felt our hand. He was about to look down. I want to be careful here, because this is the part where, if you've heard the story before, you've probably heard it told like a battle. Lasers and explosions and humans charging. It wasn't that. Please understand, it wasn't that. We had wrenches. We never forgot we had wrenches. What happened was the ship started to fight to free itself, and the flats started to fight to keep it pinned. And for one long, terrible hour, those two things ground against each other in the dark. The Altu vessel poured power into its drive. The river around it turned to steam. One of our cables snapped, Tomas's winch line, and the cable whipped back across the terminal and took out a light pole and could have killed a dozen people. And Tomas just grabbed the next line and chained it in and kept pulling, his hands torn open, screaming at the rest of us to hold, hold, hold. And we held. When the ship tried to lift, when it strained upward to climb off the snarl, Boone's crew dropped the next load. We kept the cranes loaded. Every time the ship fought to rise, the flats dropped another 30 tons of steel onto it from above, pinning it back down, burying it deeper in its trap. Jerome up in his cab, weeping, hauling, dropping, hauling, a man fighting a starship with a 40-year-old crane and winning by inches. The ship started to fire. I won't dress it up. It started to fire, blind, panicked blue light tearing into the terminal, into the scrapyards, into the dark where it thought its attackers were. It hit the old cannery. It hit Fam's whole block. It killed people. It killed people I'd known my whole life, and I'm not going to pretend it didn't, because they earned the truth too. The flats bled that night. We paid for what we did. But here is the thing the Altu could not understand, the thing that wasn't in any column of their survey. It was firing at a neighborhood that had already decided. You can't make people run who have already chosen not to. You can't break a line that isn't a line, that's just a scrapyard full of cousins, all of whom would rather die holding the winch than live having let go of it. The ship fired into us, and we held, and we held, and we held, and the thing could not get free, and slowly, slowly, its great pale flank began to crack against the steel teeth of our river. And then the harbor noticed. That was the whole point, of course. That was the entire desperate plan. Make the trapped ship scream loud enough that the harbor would have to send help up the channel. And the harbor did. Out in the sound, the Altu cluster lit up, and 2 more vessels detached and turned toward the river mouth to free their stranded ship. But to reach it, they had to come up the channel. Past us. And we had been so busy these 9 nights. The wall at the turn was only the part the trapped ship found. There were other parts. Boone had wanted redundancy, had insisted on it, and thank God we'd listened. The whole lower channel, the entire winding length the rescue ships now had to travel, was seeded. Sunken cable runs at 3 more pinch points, more snarls, more cranes on the other terminals manned by more crews, waiting in the dark for the exact same signal. The first rescue ship came up the channel fast, angry, no longer slow and unworried, and it hit our second wall going far too quick, and it fouled worse than the first. Cables in its drive, steel in its belly. It slewed sideways and grounded against the pilings hard enough that we heard its hull buckle. And the third ship saw what happened to the second, and it stopped. It stopped at the river mouth, and it would not come in. Think about that. Think about what that means. a species that crosses the void between stars, that emptied the towers of downtown without breaking stride. That ship looked up our brown, poisoned river, at the junkyard and the cranes and the dark full of people it could not see, and it decided the cost was too high. It decided the flats were too expensive. We had done the one thing we set out to do. We had made ourselves something the Altu scanner had no value for and no defense against. We had made ourselves not worth it. The third ship pulled back to the harbor. The two ships in our river were dead, not destroyed. We couldn't destroy them, but grounded, gutted, fouled, going nowhere. Their crews eventually abandoning them in small craft that fled back to the Sound and did not return. And then the strangest thing of the whole strange war happened. Nothing. For 2 days, nothing. The harbor sat out in the Sound and did not come for us. No fleet, no reprisal, no van with its bored, clean voice. The Altu, who had decided we were nothing, had now decided we were something else, something I think frightened them more than an army would have. We were unprofitable. We were a margin that bit. We were a stretch of obsolete ground that had just cost them 3 ships to learn was not worth one. And then, and this is the part I still don't fully understand, the part that took the war out of our hands entirely, the harbor began to leave. We learned later it wasn't only us. Of course it wasn't only us. All up and down the coast, in 100 poor forgotten places the Altu had filed under clearance eligible, the same thing had been happening. The ones they ignored had had time. The fishing towns, the reservation lands, the industrial flats and the failing Rust Belt cities, and every place the scanner had called low value. The strong man hadn't been watching any of them, and all of them had used it, each in their own way, with their own rivers and their own cranes and their own stubborn, obsolete hands. The Altu had built a whole strategy on the idea that the weak parts of us could be safely ignored. And it turned out the weak parts of us were where we kept the teeth. They didn't win the harbor. The cost of every poor district they'd written off, all biting at once, all turning their own forgotten ground into traps, it tipped the math. Somewhere out past the moon, in whatever passes for a boardroom among people like that, a column finally went red. And the math said leave. So they left. I didn't see the last ship go. I was asleep, finally, for the first time in 2 weeks, on the floor of the garage with my arm around Boone's shoulders, both of us out cold from a kind of exhaustion I didn't know a body could hold. Pillar woke us. 16 years old, up on the cannery roof again, who'd been there the whole time. She didn't shout it. She came down the ladder and she walked over and she shook my shoulder and she said, very quietly, like she didn't quite believe it, "Des, the sky's empty." We buried our people the next week. I want to end on that, not on the leaving, because the leaving wasn't the win. The leaving was just the result. The win was the burying, the fact that we got to do it, that we got to stand in our own ground, in the rain, in the gray, and put our dead in the earth ourselves, as free people, in a place that was still ours. We lost 41. I knew the name of everyone. Old man Pham was not among them. He lived. He lived another 4 years and got to sit in his shop and tell the story to anyone who'd listen, and he told it better than I ever could. But Marisol's husband Tomas, who'd wanted to run, who stayed, who pulled the winch with his hands torn to the bone, Tomas didn't make it through that last hour. He went holding the line. I told Marisol he was the bravest man I'd ever stood beside, and that wasn't a kindness. It was just true. We left the 2 grounded ships in the river. They're still there. The city, what's left of it, what's rebuilding, wanted to cut them up for study, and some of that happened, but the flats said no to most of it. We left them, pale and beached and silent in our brown water, slowly going green with our weather, our rust, our river. We left them as a reminder. Not for us. We don't need reminding. For anyone who ever flies over this place again and runs a scanner across it and reads our cheap dirt and our old machines and our hard, tired hands, and lets their clean, bored voice call it obsolete. Low value, negligible capability, clearance eligible. People ask me sometimes what I learned. Reporters mostly, historians once or twice. They want a clean line for the end of the article. I always tell them the same thing, and they never use it because it's not what they want. But I'll give it to you because you stayed for the whole thing and you earned the real one. They didn't lose because we were strong. We weren't strong. We were a poor neighborhood with wrenches. They lost because they decided who mattered before they ever looked. They sorted the world into worth watching and not, and they put us in the second pile, and they were so sure of that sorting that they handed us the only weapon they could never take back, the freedom of the unwatched. Every empire that ever fell from the part it stopped looking at. The strong man's mistake is always the same one, Pham said. He doesn't look at you. So we taught the sky, a thing the flats already knew. There is no such thing as a low-value district. There's only ground that hasn't been pushed yet, and the people standing on it, waiting in the dark, holding the line with their cheap, obsolete hands.